Let's be honest. You've broken a rule today. Maybe it was small, a speed limit slightly ignored, a deadline quietly extended in your own head, a policy you technically agreed to but decided in practice didn't really apply to your specific situation. A thing you told yourself counted as a loophole when it was, in fact, just a rule you didn't want to follow. And the interesting thing is, you probably don't feel particularly bad about it, because there's a part of every human brain that doesn't experience rules as moral imperatives. It experiences them as suggestions. Strong suggestions, maybe. Suggestions with consequences, but suggestions nonetheless. Where did that come from? Is the rule-breaking instinct a flaw, a moral weakness unique to modernity, to our distracted, individualistic, screen-addicted age? Or is it something much older, something that was here long before laws, long before courts, long before anyone had written a rule down at all? Here's what the evidence says. Rule-breaking is ancient. It is, in some ways, as old as rules themselves. And the story of the first rules humans ever broke and got away with is not a story about criminals or delinquents. It's a story about what it means to be human in a group, to have your own interests, your own desires, your own version of fairness, and to live alongside other people who have theirs. Let's go back, way back, to before writing, before cities, before kings and courts and legal systems, to the place where rules actually came from. For most of human prehistory, we lived in small bands, roughly 20 to 50 people. And in those bands, there were absolutely rules, not written ones, not enforced by a police force or a court system, but rules nonetheless, unspoken, understood, and backed by something more powerful than any law: social consequence. Share the food. Don't take more than your share. Don't touch another person's mate. Don't attack someone within the group. Contribute to hunts, to childcare, to camp maintenance. Pull your weight. These weren't abstract moral principles, they were practical survival agreements, the terms of cooperation that made group living possible. Break them, and you weren't just violating a norm, you were threatening the group's survival. And the group's response could range from social pressure to exile, which, as we've already established, was effectively a death sentence. So the stakes were real, the rules were real, and yet, people broke them anyway. We know this because anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies, groups whose social structure gives us a meaningful window into how our ancestors lived, find rule-breaking everywhere, constantly, creatively, in ways that are immediately and almost comically recognizable. The first and probably ancient rule humans ever broke, the sharing rule. In hunter-gatherer societies around the world, sharing is not optional. It's the foundation of the entire social economy. When a hunt is successful, the meat is distributed according to custom, according to kinship, according to need. There are often detailed, culturally specific rules about who gets which part of which animal, who has first claim, how portions are divided. These rules exist because in a world without refrigeration, without storage, without money, meat is the most valuable perishable resource you have, and the only way to make it last, effectively, is to share it, because today's recipient is tomorrow's hunter, and the web of reciprocal obligation is what keeps everyone fed over time. But here's what researchers actually observe consistently across cultures. People cheat. Not dramatically, not obviously, but quietly, systematically, in ways that are carefully calibrated to stay just below the threshold of what the group will actually call out. A hunter who kills a large animal will sometimes butcher it partially out of sight before bringing it back to camp, ensuring that certain choice cuts arrive already separated, ready to share quietly with a preferred ally or mate before the formal sharing process begins. The best pieces distributed privately, the remainder shared publicly. The whole thing performed with enough apparent generosity that no one wants to be the person who complains. This is a rule-breaking strategy so sophisticated it requires planning, deception, knowledge of social norms well enough to work around them, and enough social intelligence to know exactly how much you can take before someone says something. Sound familiar? It's the prehistoric equivalent of expensing a personal meal on a business trip. The structure is identical. The instinct is identical. Only the context has changed. The second ancient rule break: status manipulation. In every human group, ancient and modern, status matters. Who has authority? Who gets deference? Who has access to the best resources, the best alliances, the best opportunities for reproduction? In small bands, status hierarchies were real, meaningful, and consequential, and they were also constantly being gamed. Not through open challenge, that was risky, potentially violent, and could backfire badly, but through subtler means, building private alliances without declaring them, quietly undermining a rival's reputation through selective information sharing, telling the right people the right things about what someone did without ever making a direct accusation, taking credit for collective successes, deflecting blame for collective failures, positioning yourself near high-status individuals in ways that implied association without requiring reciprocity. All of this, anthropologists note, was happening constantly in small-scale societies. The political maneuvering in a prehistoric band was not simpler than modern office politics. In some ways, it was more intense, because you couldn't leave. You couldn't quit and find another job. You were stuck with these exact people in this exact hierarchy, and your position in it determined almost everything about your life. So people gamed the system, constantly, carefully, with remarkable creativity, and the ones who were best at it, who could game the system without being caught, who could bend the rules without breaking them obviously enough to trigger punishment, those individuals did better. They ate better. They reproduced more successfully. They survived longer. Evolution, again, doing what evolution does. The third ancient rule break: the sex rules. Every human society, without exception, has rules about sex. Who can sleep with whom, which relationships are permitted, which are forbidden, which require formal negotiation, which are simply off-limits. Incest taboos, rules about the mates of allies, rivals, kin. Rules about appropriate partners based on age, status, kinship category. And every human society, without exception, has people breaking those rules, secretly, carefully, with considerable ingenuity. Archaeological and anthropological evidence for this is extensive and consistent. Genetic studies of ancient and modern populations regularly reveal reproductive patterns that don't match the officially sanctioned social structures. Children whose biological parentage doesn't align with who they were supposed to belong to by the rules of their society. Affairs conducted with enough care that they lasted years. Relationships maintained in public as one thing while being something else entirely in private. The rules around sex are, in many ways, the oldest and most universal example of humans creating a norm and then immediately beginning to look for exceptions, loopholes, and workarounds. Because the desire that the rules are designed to regulate is, by definition, stronger than most rules. It was here before the rules.
It will outlast the rules. The rules were always going to be working uphill. Now, let's talk about something slightly different. Not just breaking rules for personal gain, but breaking rules that were wrong. Because here's a part of the story that often gets left out. Some of the first rules humans ever broke were worth breaking, and getting away with it was sometimes genuinely important. Anthropological research on hunter-gatherer societies reveals something fascinating. These groups had strong egalitarian norms, strong resistance to any single individual accumulating too much power or dominance over the rest. And they enforced these norms actively, through gossip, through ridicule, through collective refusal, through what researchers call counter-dominant coalitions, groups of people who would band together specifically to pull down anyone who tried to dominate too aggressively. But those counter-dominant coalitions were themselves a form of rule-breaking. The dominant individual had power, they had allies, they had expectations of deference, and the people who stood up to them, who refused to defer, who coordinated in private to resist, they were breaking the existing power structure. They were, in the most literal sense, breaking the rule that said, this person is in charge. And when they succeeded, when they managed to check the power of someone who was abusing it, that was not just survival. That was, in some meaningful way, justice. A form of justice older than any court, older than any law, operating through social coordination, collective action, and the courage of people who decided that a rule being enforced did not make it right. This matters because it complicates the simple story about rule breaking. Rule breaking isn't just selfishness, it isn't just cheating. It is also, sometimes, the mechanism through which bad rules get challenged, tested, and eventually changed.
Every social norm that has ever been revised, every law that has been overturned, every custom that has been questioned, every hierarchy that has been dismantled, began with someone breaking it, usually quietly, usually at personal risk, sometimes getting away with it, sometimes not. The capacity for rule breaking is not separable from the capacity for moral progress. They come from the same source. The ability to look at an existing rule, compare it to your own sense of what's right, and decide that your sense of what's right takes precedence. That judgment, that moment of weighing the rule against the principle, is not a modern invention. It is ancient. It is human. And it has been happening in caves and camps and villages and courts for as long as we have been a species capable of making rules at all. So let's bring this back to you. Today, at some point, you will probably bend a rule. Maybe you already have. And you will probably feel one of two things, depending on which kind of rule it is. A small, quiet guilt, the low hum of knowing you've taken a shortcut that wasn't quite yours to take. Or something more complex, a sense of principle, a feeling that the rule in question wasn't right, that following it without question would have required you to be less than you are. Both of those feelings are ancient. Both of them have been felt by every generation of humans that has ever lived, in bands on the savannah, in early villages, in ancient cities, in medieval kingdoms, in the offices and apartments and commutes and group chats of right now. The rules change, the systems change, the specific shortcuts and workarounds and quiet rebellions change with them. But the human at the center, the one quietly calculating how much they can get away with, or quietly deciding that some things matter more than the rules that govern them, that human has never changed at all. The first rule humans ever broke was probably a sharing rule, quietly, carefully, with one eye on who was watching, which, honestly, sounds about right.